Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Welcome to episode 2 in the analysis of the 5-page letter. And in this episode, I'm going to go into far more detail in terms of the content of the letter than I did in the first episode. Now, I do think it's a legitimate question to question the legitimacy of the note. I think it's perfectly fair to say, is the note genuine, right? But on the other hand, I also think it's sort of silly and farcical, because if you say the note is real, well, what's in the note isn't real anyway. Do you know what I mean? What is in the note is someone who's in prison, someone who's facing the sentence he's facing, trying to wriggle out of it. So whether the note is real or not, the sentiments inside the note are not meaningless, but they aren't valid, put it that way. But nevertheless, I do think, it's a question worth asking, is the note real or isn't it? Now, if you're one of those people saying the note's not real, or I've even heard people saying you can create an app and, you can sort of, create something like this with someone's handwriting with a sample. Well, then I wonder what you're doing on this video, because this video is to talk about the contents of the note, right? So obviously, if you don't think it's real, well, then leave and go and deal with something that you feel is worth your time. For the rest, I did sort of look into it a little bit. Not that I think there's any point to it, because as I say, it's not as though we are trying to really solve a case here. Chris Watts is the person who's responsible, is in jail, and we know what is going on. I do think what the doubts and the concerns about, whether the note is fake, I do think what that expresses about the Watts case is this whole maelstrom of noise and nonsense around the Watts case. And I think that is the world we're living in now, where you can't really have a conversation about anything without someone saying, oh no, that's all fake. And it's been going on for a long time. We heard about it for a long time, for example, about climate change. Oh no, that's all nonsense. And almost anything that comes about, whether it's urgent or not, is someone else's nonsense, right? And I suppose you've got to trust someone, you've got to trust your own judgment, or you've got to trust some particular channel or whoever it is, that they've got the sort of discerning standards that you respect, or that you feel are necessary to have, right? So, as I say, it's probably a valid question, but within a sort of overall invalid direction that we're going on. So whether the letter's valid or not, it's not really taking you anywhere either way, right? But what I will say is, it is important in a situation like this just to do some basic analysis and say, is this letter likely genuine, right? And there are a couple of ways that you can figure that out without being a handwriting expert. And so I'll quickly take you through what I did. So one of the best ways just to assess the genuineness, the authenticity of handwriting, is to compare it to another genuine sample, right? So you wouldn't really want to compare this letter to another letter that you're not sure if he wrote either. You'd want to compare it to something that is definitely from Chris Watts' hand, right? And so an example of that would be the birthday cards that he wrote to Nicole Kessinger. There's a fair amount of writing there, and you could compare the handwriting on the cards. You could compare letters and all sorts of things. You could compare the size. These are all basics, but you could compare the size of the handwriting. You could compare the spacing of the handwriting, as some people have mentioned. But I think one of the best ways to check it is take a complete word that's repeated, and in this case it's the word Nikki, and look at how that word corresponds or doesn't correspond to the card, right? The other thing is I think some people have said, this is just an app or something that is, did this, but if you compare the word Nikki, Nikki, throughout the letter, it does look slightly different, but also it's coherent. It's there's a continuity in how it's written. There's a strange smallness to the upward and downward stroke of the capital N, and then there's a strange sort of backward looping of the top of the N on the far side, right? It's also quite interesting how small Watts makes his letter I. The I and the dot above the I are almost the same length, and I think that shows a person who's who himself, his identity, his persona, is struggling to get off the ground. It's struggling to get off the level of the line in his writing. And then you've also got the interesting contrast between the I in Nikki. Both of the I's are very short and small, and then the word I representing himself. It's the capital letter I, and it's certainly taller than the small letter I, but it's nevertheless somewhat short, and then it's got fairly big caps on either end. In other words, the foot and the head of the I are actually quite wide, quite overdone, almost like there's a weight pushing down on him from above, and he's sort of stuck with something below him, and in that space of walking on eggshells, that's where he finds himself. And if you take some of the other letters that are around that, the length the width of the I is almost as wide as a word like was, that involves 3 letters. That line is really quite wide, right? And so the letter I and the way he writes it also corresponds to the birthday card. Something else that's quite interesting is his use of exclamation marks. Now, I'm an author. I've just finished writing my 101st book. And by the way, the audiobook is just going on Patreon today, the first chapter. So for those interested in the 1996 Everest disaster, go and check that out. It's on the $5 tier. But as an author, I'm not someone who often uses exclamation marks. I just don't. And I used one in one of the last chapters, and I sort of was aware, wow, I'm actually using an exclamation mark. But what I find certainly interesting with Chris Watts using exclamation marks is he comes across as quite a understated, reserved person. He seems like a person who's very calm, and yet not so much in this 5-page letter, although there is the exclamation mark here and there. For example, where he says that Nicole apparently smiled at him and said, "Gotcha," and there's an exclamation mark there, right? There are so many exclamation marks in his birthday cards. It is "Happy Birthday" with 3 exclamation marks, and "Don't Stop Being You" with 4 exclamation marks. So there's definitely emphasis there. And I think in that sense, in that expressive sense, I think he's quite a lot like Shanann, just someone who's very, not emotional, but sort of almost overdoing the expressive side of things, right? A problem I've got with the letter, certainly the letter as I've seen it, is there is no what do they call it when you greet someone in a letter? It's got a certain there's a certain jargon for it. I think they call it the salutation. There's no salutation, so part of what you want to know with a letter are basics like to who it's addressed and the date that it's written. So you want to know that, and then you also want to know how it ends off, how it signs off. So the the opening and the closing are really important. Who it's addressed to, and the signature at the end are very important. And so the fact that this letter doesn't have that, for me, is somewhat problematic. But other than that, I'm certainly willing to, consider it as genuine. And if you're not, that's fine. And, as I say, ultimately you end up at the same place, because what's in the letter doesn't really take you anywhere. But for the purposes of people who are interested in this case and who are interested in this letter, there are a couple of things that are interesting. Some of them are, for example, his word choices, using the word retaliated. Also, he refers to the 110-minute conversation. Well, actually, it wasn't 110 minutes, it was 111 minutes. And one could argue and say, well, for someone who's got such a detailed memory and knows numbers, that's a bit of an odd error. Another thing that certainly corresponds to my impression of Chris Watts is whenever he writes numbers, the numbers are quite big. And so when you look at the numbers 110, when he writes the number 12 in August 12th, and also 13 in August 13th, the numbers dwarf the letters. So you kind of get the sense that is how his brain works. His brain thinks in numbers and in a fairly logical way. And in terms of the details, he's quite small-minded, right? And I had a thought earlier that I meant to convey when we were talking about the I's, is that the way that he writes the letter I for me is quite simplistic. It's just a very basic I, and isn't that what Chris Watts is like? The I, when he's referring to himself, is very basic, and the little I's, when he's writing Nikki's name or any other word with the I in it, is very small. And that is the sense I get from him, is that this is a person who's very small in his experience of being alive. He's got a very small experience. It's not that he's humble, it's that he's very cowed and intimidated by the world that he finds himself in. And although he presents himself to the world as this I, he's not really that way. He's actually crushed in between what people think of him coming from the top and what he thinks about himself, and perhaps those close to him, how they know him, coming from the bottom. Now, I didn't really mean to do any kind of handwriting analysis of the letter. What I really want to do is look at the content of the letter. And in the same way with the Ramsey ransom note, you can see a lot of traces of the type of person the author is, not through so much the idiosyncrasies of the handwriting, but through the actual content of what they are talking about. And that, I think, is a big aspect missing from the Ramsey ransom note, that debate. I did actually make a video that basically repeats almost the entire Ramsey ransom note from movie quotes, which I think no one has done before, and that's certainly maybe worth watching. So I'll put a link to that in the description if you're interested. So some of the things that he says here are a repeat of things that he said during his second confession. He said something about, I felt when I woke up that morning that I was in a trance. Well, number one, I don't think he did wake up that morning. I don't think he ever went to sleep. And I don't think he was in a trance. I think he was very clear in what he was doing because it was premeditated. So he'd decided before he did what he did where he was going to take them. And he had a motive. I mean, he knew why he was doing it. He didn't just act at random. So that also sort of resonates with what we already know. And he's just trying to reinforce it. But that's also coming back to what I said yesterday about intent. By fiddling with intent, he says, well, I was in a trance. I didn't know what I was doing. Except he wasn't in a trance. He may have been sleep deprived. And I do think there's a little bit of truth to that, in that he was kind of in this weird place, this weird, unreal place where his home eventually felt like a ghost town, in his words. And he was in the trance, if you want to call it that, of being caught up in an affair with Nicole Kessinger. That was really the trance that he was in. But in terms of what he did about it, I think that was pretty real and visceral. I think he knew exactly what he did. He also says something quite weirdly interesting where he says, I was in a trance, I put clothes on that were old and didn't fit and didn't mind throwing away. And I sort of wonder whether he, when he put those clothes on, he knew he was going to throw them away, and so he sort of wanted he wanted to wear clothes that he didn't want, if that makes sense. And that's definitely showing someone who's not in a trance. If you know you're going to be doing something and you're going to get your clothes dirty and you're going to get rid of them, then you would probably wear clothes that you would want to get rid of in the first place. And that certainly shows intent all of its own, right? I also think the fact that he acknowledges throwing them away is relatively obscure information. I don't know whether that's in the discovery. It could be. I know that he talks about stopping at Black Mesa. I know to some of you I'm mispronouncing it, but that's simply how I do pronounce it. But on the way back, he stopped at Black Mesa and threw some things in a dumpster. I think that was his clothing, although I don't think he's been explicit about that, but also the blankets and I think certain other things. He may have thrown away shoes, the shoes that he was wearing. He may also have thrown away black garbage bags, but certainly the blankets of the children. And who knows what else. If he used oxycodone, did he throw the capsule bottle that came in, did he throw that away? Did he throw away certain bank statements or certain letters that were going to show the financial records? I don't know if he would have thought that far. But what I think is missing here a bit is where he says he threw it away. Well, it would be good to know exactly where. I think we know where, but it would be just good to have confirmation on that. In his description, he says, I felt compelled. He said something about made my lunch and went back upstairs. I felt compelled, like I had to do this. I think that's true. I think he did feel that he had to do something. I think he was in a situation where he felt that things were coming to a inexorable conclusion, and that he'd led Shanann to believe a certain reality, meaning that they're going to go to Aspen, and that he's had a change of heart. He had his doubts, but now is feeling good about the relationship, and they actually can go to counseling. But she did that just so that she would leave for the weekend. But now that she's coming back, he's now got to face the reality that is created for them, while at the same time he's got to deal with the reality that is created for Kessinger. And now there's like no more room to move because things have come to a head. There's the gender reveal. So no wonder he felt compelled. He was going to be in a really awkward situation if he simply did nothing and then things just played out, right? I think he felt he would lose Kessinger. He would have lost her. But I also think he probably felt he was going to get into a world of trouble from Shanann, who was about to find out, where he was on Saturday night. And that was something that he probably felt that was inevitable. No matter whether he was saying to Shanann, okay, let's work on the marriage, she was going to find out very soon that he was having an affair. She already suspected it, but it was a matter of time before she gave him kind of a lie detector test, sort of one-on-one, right? I mean, she's also going to find out that he hadn't written a response to a letter, that he hadn't read the book, that he'd thrown it away. And so he knew that he had to do something. Someone, I think, commented, I can't remember if it was on YouTube or Patreon, but just saying that Chris Watts sort of seems to think that this is everybody else's fault except his own. He's the victim here. He's got this victim psychology. And on the one page he says, I battle with this all the time. So many voices have been in my ear telling me I didn't do this. And, that kind of thing, it's quite manipulative, but I do think, although I don't agree with that, I don't think that, I think he's using that to say, I've got a lot of support. There are a lot of people who believe me. I do think that there's some truth in that. He is battling with, he doesn't know who to turn to, he doesn't know who to believe, because he can't seem to function independently, right? He can't seem to make up his mind what to do and to make choices, because they've always been made for him. And in this respect, I certainly agree with people who say, this guy couldn't have done this, he couldn't have acted alone. I understand that that's based on reality. I'm saying that he was a person who needed to sort of walk on the coattails of somebody else, needed to, someone else's shoulder to sort of carry him, right? That's certainly true. But I don't think in a singular incident like the one that he committed, I don't think he was unable to act. I think there's, in a long process, is someone who's defeated by the complexity of what needs to be done, right? So something like a divorce or, something that involves a long, complicated social process. I think that was something that he found very intimidating, whereas something like what he did on the night of August 13th, I think that was something else. I also think he felt he was quite good dealing with physical things, right? Bear in mind he was quite physically fit when all of this happened, whereas when it comes to social aspects, again, with a sort of a mental side to it, whether it's going to court and defending yourself, I don't think he really felt that he had any game for that, and I don't think he did. So he really was a house of cards. He really was capable of coming up with a little bit of game in short bursts, but over a long period, he simply didn't believe in himself. He simply had no idea how to act or what to do. And you even got that sense in that recording we have of him talking about the 35C to that one defense investigator. I can't remember his name now, but just saying, I don't know where to start. I don't know whether to put everything into the 35C or this much or that much. Remember that. He also talks in his letter about, he implicates someone, and then he says, he actually says, I suspect Nikki, right? And then he says, I can't prove it. Well, that's absolutely no good. The fact that I don't even believe this is a legitimate letter, meaning, if he wrote it, I don't think that he really believes what he's even saying. But even if that's the case, the fact that he acknowledges he can't even prove what he's saying in something that is not even close to being legitimate is crazy. It just shows you how weak his defense is. And I think it also shows that he's not the smartest tool in the shed. Because I certainly thought early on that he could potentially have quite a strong case based on the fact that there was very little evidence implicating him. Very little evidence at the house, right? Inside the house. And just the unbelievability of what happened at the service site. There were people who just didn't believe that anyone could be in those tanks. And so if you played with certain of those aspects, you could have a fairly strong defense. But he had no idea where to even start with that particular game. And instead, in his simplistic mind, the only way to deal with wriggling out of this was just by pointing the finger to somebody else. And that wasn't really going to cut it. Because if you're going to do that, you would need evidence to back up your pointing your finger to someone else. And there wasn't really any of that. there was a little bit of evidence, not even evidence, but there was a little bit of a possibility that if Shanann had been drinking, you could make up a certain thing that, if she was pregnant and drinking, then that showed someone who was a certain way or whatever. But then there was no evidence that she had consumed alcohol on the flight or over the weekend. No one said, yes, I actually saw that Shanann was drinking wine or anything like that. And so if Chris Watts was able to, for example, counter that aspect, then there may have been something there, but there simply wasn't. So in my opinion, and I'm certainly not trying to help Chris Watts, I do believe that he's beyond help. So, when I say this, I'm not trying to offer him legal advice, because I think even if he took it, it wouldn't get him very far. But I do think if he was trying to reduce his sentence, his best bet would have been to look at the chemicals that were in his system and things like sleep deprivation, right? And then say, well, to some extent, he wasn't quite himself. I don't mean that psychologically. I think he was fully in possession of himself in that sense. But I mean, to some extent, compromised by lack of sleep and by the long run-up of, being sleep deprived for quite a long period by being on these Thrive patches, right? And unfortunately, even if he went that route, he wouldn't be able to prove it because his body wasn't tested, his blood wasn't tested for any of those substances. I also think if he went that route, the counter argument would be, well, he was well enough to appear on television on the Tuesday morning, right? And he was well enough to appear at the police station and, do pretty well for himself, answer pretty well the 4 hours of questions that Coda asked him, right? And when he was asked if he was tired, he said, no, I'm fine, let's carry on, and Coda then went on and on and on. The same then applied the next day. It was only very late in the day that he kind of complained, this is Wednesday, that he complained of being a little bit tired. And, you did see him sleeping in the cubicle, I think it was around about 6 o'clock that evening. But that's a little bit late to say, wow, I was so compromised by fatigue that I wasn't thinking straight. If he had said something about that much, much earlier, then that, I think, could be considered a factor. Where Chris Watts says something about, I go over it all the time in my mind. It felt like I was hunted like prey. He says, she found someone broken and devoured me whole. It's pretty symbolic language there. I think what he's failing to admit there is how much he enjoyed being with her and, what they were doing when they were together. I think he's leaving that part out. And although he's using very kind of graphic language there, I mean, you can't even begin to say that that was the case. You can't begin to say that the thing that he's describing there happened in the least. And I don't want to be too salacious here, but, in the text between Kessinger and her friend Charlotte, if you're talking about devouring, they spoke about what he was doing in the you-know-what sense. And so, if anything, it seemed like he was really, to some extent, she was pursuing him, but he was certainly pursuing what he wanted, wasn't he? It is interesting that he describes himself at that point as broken, when he was actually physically fit. He was, quite strong. He was in quite good shape. And I think the only broken thing about him at that point was his marriage and also their finances. But, he was nevertheless at that point, committed to fixing the marriage by having a child, right? And to some extent, I think he was already thinking about downsizing. So I don't really think that he felt that broken, really. I think what was going on, the appearance of what was going on wasn't really working anymore. And, I think what did break was when he had the affair. He broke trust with Shanann. He broke those vows, and he also was sort of breaking his love for his own family and his own children by doing that. And then what he did beyond that was severing that bond in an actual way. Okay. He also talks about he had no control, and all of that is the sort of thing. If he'd been studying in the legal library, then the language of intent is not having control over your actions, and so that's what he's trying to emphasize. It felt like I had no control. Unfortunately, Chris, that's not good enough. You can't feel like you're not in control. You've got to, for whatever reason, not be in control. But then that wasn't the case here. Where Chris Watts says, I know that evidence points to Shanann. That's simply not true. There is no evidence pointing to that. And this again shows a worrying problem with him, that he doesn't seem to actually know what evidence is. Him saying that doesn't constitute evidence. He talks about opening up and confiding in Kissinger as the first of many mistakes. Now, he probably regrets what has happened, and he regrets perhaps meeting Kissinger. I think if he got away with it, then he wouldn't regret it, and he'd be glad that he met Kissinger, right? But I do think what is quite interesting, I know that a part of me was thinking, when people spoke about narcissism, they tend to see narcissism as just one particular thing, that there's just unhealthy narcissism, but there's also healthy narcissism. And I felt that Chris Watts had a very unhealthy narcissism, where he let people walk all over him. He wasn't really he didn't have any agency in his own life, and he got a little bit of that through his affair with Kissinger. I'm certainly not saying this is a good way or a recommended way to find agency. But in his particular case, I think he was challenged to stand up for something, certainly, maybe not a good thing. And certainly in one sense, he was doing something that he had needed to do all along, which was talk to somebody, communicate, share, come out of himself, right? And so in that sense, it was a good thing that was happening. How he applied it certainly wasn't good. But I did think that was something that was necessary for everybody, that Chris Watts get some backbone and sort of acknowledge who he is and what is going on, and kind of start anchoring himself in reality. And I think Kissinger was to some extent a good influence on that, to say, do you realize what kind of person you are? You need to kind of take a stand in your own life, kind of thing. And I just don't think that he knew how to do that, and she didn't know. She didn't know that he didn't know how to do that. And I think he did know, and he was trying to keep that a secret. And if you take that further, as soon as he got caught, he just defaulted back to the old Chris. He's now not going to open up, or if he opens up, it's opening up but not telling the truth about what he's talking about. And he has then gone on to confide in a lot of other people that have taken advantage of him. And it just shows he's got very poor people skills when it comes to knowing who to trust. And that comes from never really engaging with the world, never engaging with people, because so that when you do, you don't know really who you're dealing with. You don't know that they're actually trying to pull your strings, right? So I think you'll agree with me that whether you contest the legitimacy of the note or not, it certainly brings up some interesting points. As I say, I think this note was written by him, and it does, although it's mostly nonsense and it's certainly not going to take him anywhere in a legal sense, I think it does take us into some interesting places in his psychology, and also his psychology with Nicole Kessinger. I also think it takes it into some interesting places in terms of the mechanics of this incident and then also his marriage. And I think in that respect alone, it's maybe worth talking about. What do you guys think? So I don't think I'm going to take it further than that. I'll probably resume with the Shakedown blogs in the next episode. On Sunday, I'll be talking about something that's really interesting, managing your fear, and I'll be doing that in a live stream at 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. That will also be dealing with Chris Watts. How should he have managed his fear in the situation? How could things have turned out differently? It also applies to Shanann, also applies to Nicole Kessinger, it applies to people climbing Mount Everest, it applies to you in your life. What does it mean to manage your fear? But that is certainly something that is very applicable in true crime. So we're going to talk about that in a live on Sunday, Eastern Standard Time. So I hope to see you guys there. Thank you for listening. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and I'll see you guys next time.